Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome back, everyone. This week, we are going to talk about personality disorders. So this sounds kind of vague, and our main focus for personality disorders this week is going to be narcissism. And some of the things that we're going to talk about is what exactly makes a person a narcissist and how to identify them, because they can be quite difficult to have any type of relationship with. So let's back up first, though, and talk, what do we mean by personality disorders? How would you describe a personality disorder?
Personality disorders, I think it's fascinating. Mm-hmm. So Liz, you're going to have to watch the clock because I could go on for a long time about this one. I think it's really interesting. So let's just talk about personality in general. Personality is the way we think, feel, behave that makes us, say, different from other people. And so in some ways, it's kind of what makes us unique. And our personality is influenced by experiences, our environment, and mostly the environment is really family of origin, how we grew up, parenting, siblings even, surroundings, where you grow up, and then inherited characteristics. And so typically we think of personality as being pretty stable throughout the lifespan, that typically it doesn't change much. Now, if you think about a personality disorder, then that is a way of thinking, feeling, or behaving that deviates in some way from the expectations of the culture. That also causes some distress or problems in functioning. And that personality disorder lasts over time. So again, like your personality, where it becomes stable, once people have a personality disorder, it's really difficult to change that. Let me just give you a brief example of what I mean culturally, because some people may be curious about that. For many years, I had a French client. So she was from France. We spoke French occasionally in session, but her behavior often was really reminiscent of what we would call in our culture a histrionic personality disorder. But in her culture, it was not. And so she wouldn't, whereas I thought, okay, you're really qualifying for this personality disorder. But back in France, she wouldn't. And so it's just a way of behaving or expressing oneself that is outside the cultural norm.
Okay.
Does that make sense to you, that it is culturally dependent in a lot of ways?
Yeah, it does. So why don't you first explain what a histrionic?
Okay, so there are how many? I think there are 10 or 11 different personality disorders. I'm just going to go through them, and I'll stop briefly and tell you what histrionic is. Histrionic is a pattern of excessive emotion or attention thinking. They typically are uncomfortable when they are not the center of attention. And often, here's kind of one of the defining characteristics, is they use their physical appearance often to draw attention to themselves. So often the way they dress may be somewhat provocative because it then tends to draw attention to themselves. So histrionic is one. Let me just run through, because we aren't going to have time to go through all of these, and we're going to focus mostly on narcissistic personality disorder. So there's antisocial personality disorder, avoidant, borderline personality disorder. And I'm going to come back and just talk really briefly about that, because that's also one that a lot of listeners are probably going to be familiar with. Dependent personality disorder, obsessive compulsive personality disorder, paranoid, schizoid personality disorder, and then what we call schizotypal personality disorder. So also what defines a personality disorder is that they affect these different areas. It affects the way we think about ourselves and about others. I think, again, one of the defining characteristics, it defines how we respond emotionally. And so often the way, if someone has a personality disorder, then they're responding emotionally in a way that is somehow outside the norm for the culture.
Mm-hmm.
That goes along with that is how we relate to other people.
Mm-hmm.
And then also another defining characteristic, how we control our own behavior, or maybe more accurately, how we don't do a very good job of controlling our behavior. Mm-hmm. And so in a lot of personality disorders, you'll see that it'll appear like the person has very little control over their behavior, especially that emotional response and how they interact with other people. With personality disorders, it causes some distress. But there are some characteristics that I think are common to most personality disorders, and that is that people with personality disorders often create chaos in their life.
Yes.
And there are a lot of different ideas of the reason that people create the chaos. I think the one that makes the most sense to me, is that often with some of these personality disorders, they feel kind of empty inside emotionally. Mm-hmm. And one of the ways they create a feeling of being or a feeling of meaning is to create the chaos, because then there's always something going on in their life. Mm-hmm. Or there's always a problem that they have to solve or help people with. And so it keeps them feeling like there's something going on in their life. They aren't empty. So feeling chaotic, I think, that's a defining characteristic. So another one is, this is what makes it really hard to treat personality disorders. And we'll go into that later, but they never think it's their issue.
Yep.
It's always somebody else's problem.
It's never their fault.
I hear a personal story in there in your response that maybe we can get to later. But so it's always going to be somebody else's problem. And so you get them in your office and they're talking about their relationships with other people and they seem problematic. It's not their fault ever. So that makes treatment very, very difficult. Mm-hmm. So let me just talk very briefly about borderline, because it's one of the personality disorders that people may be familiar with. Mm-hmm. The term borderline, I think, can be confusing. It's still confusing to me a little bit. It sounds
weird. Borderline? Like borderline think, what?
What? A borderline between what? And that's a very good question. Yeah. So what it is, it's borderline between what we call psychosis and neurosis. Okay. So it's not really in psychosis, which is really you lose contact with the external reality. Mm-hmm. Neurosis is just defined as poor ability to adapt to one's environment, or the inability to change these patterns, these maladaptive patterns, or to have a more satisfying, rich personality. And so it's somewhere in between there. Now, here's the thing that characterizes a borderline personality disorder is they either love you or they hate you. Mm-hmm. And it's often they can flip from one extreme to the other.
Yeah.
But also that extreme can be permanent. For instance, you might be my really great friend, and then you could say something wrong or something that might offend me, and you flip. Now you're out. I'm not going to be your friend anymore. Mm-hmm. So you have that black and white thinking, good or bad. And so one of the defining characteristics is that black and white thinking, or I love you or I hate you. Very hard to treat, though, because of that inability to see their part in the relationship. So now we're going to go to narcissism, which again it's a difficult one. It's difficult to be married to a narcissist. But so you always wonder, I see couples all the time when they come in and 10 years later, they're saying, well, my husband or my wife is a narcissist. And I'm thinking in my head, well, they were that way when you married them. Uh-huh. But I think what's interesting is narcissists can be really charming.
Yes.
And they can be really charming. You've got a story to tell. I know you have, and maybe I'm pushing you into telling something that you don't want to tell.
I have someone in my life that is a narcissist. And
what is that like for you?
It's incredibly frustrating because it's like you said, that it's never their fault. And there is always something going on. And this person,
chaos? Are they creating chaos?
Yeah. And it's just there's always chaos around this person. And the defining trait that seems to me for narcissism is a lack of empathy.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really the feeling that I get is this person doesn't seem to care about anyone but themselves. And it doesn't matter how many times you can tell them, you've got to think about it from the other person's perspective. There's still X, Y, and Z of why this isn't their fault.
Mm-hmm.
And what it comes down to is this person it's difficult for everyone to be around this person.
And so let me just say something about empathy. I believe what you just said, that I think they have a lack of empathy.
Mm-hmm.
But there's some interesting research that came out, I think, last year, which actually this research was indicating that possibly narcissists really do have empathy. They just choose not to acknowledge it or use it.
Interesting. Yeah.
And so it's more of a choice rather than they don't have it. It's just, I'm not going to be empathetic because I choose not to.
Right. And, and I wonder, because this person I'm thinking of, they are good at creating sympathy for themselves.
Yeah.
Is something they're very good. And this person still has lots of friends. And the more I'm around this person, the more I wonder how, because I'm like, how is this person not burned all of their bridges? Because everyone in our circle has pretty much set boundaries and said very strict, distant boundaries of, you know what? No, I'm drawing a line, and the answer is just no. But yet this person still seems to keep, almost like they keep recreating new friendships.
I'm curious, is this person like married or an intimate personal relationship? Has been, but not now.
No.
Okay.
Nope.
And so I think it's really hard to maintain a marriage or a committed interpersonal relationship. I think friends are a little bit different. I mean, from my own experience, I've certainly had narcissistic friends. I don't anymore because it's easy to tolerate them for a while. But then if it's usually the giving is all one way,
yes,
and you don't get a lot back. And after a while, after years of that you get tired of that. You decide, okay, I'm going to move on. So I think friendships is slightly different than being married. So narcissistic personality disorder certainly causes problems in many areas of life, like certainly relationships, like we talked about, work, financial affairs. Often they aren't very good with finances. And so they are often they're unhappy and disappointed, but that's not what they, when they're not given the special treatment that they think they deserve, then they're really unhappy and disappointed. So let's go over some of the characteristics just so everybody's clear. And then I'm just going to preview this because I think there are two types of narcissism. And one I'm going to call compensatory narcissism, and that's going to be a little bit different. But this is kind of the classic narcissistic personality disorder. They have an exaggerated sense of self-importance. They feel entitled. They require excessive admiration. They expect to be recognized as superior even without achievements that warrant it. They often exaggerate their talents or achievements. Some of them they're really preoccupied with these fantasies of success, power, brilliance. They think they are superior and they can only associate with people who they perceive as being superior like themselves. They often monopolize conversations. They look down on other people who they think are inferior. They take advantage of others. They're exploitative often. They have an inability or unwillingness to recognize the needs and feelings of others. That goes back to the empathy. So even here, they're acknowledging that it may not be that they can't, although that's the inability, it's the unwillingness to acknowledge, because the only people who are important in the world are themselves. Nobody else is important. And so often they're envious of others who they think, maybe have more money, more status, maybe are more handsome, more beautiful. So that's kind of the classic narcissistic personality disorder. But I think it's really important to talk about compensatory narcissism. Okay. Now that's different because rather than this coming from genuine feelings of self-confidence and high self-esteem, Compensatory narcissism really comes from an underlying sense of insecurity and weakness. And so it's almost what they do. They, lack of strong self-esteem. And so it's kind of, they flip it upside down. So instead of feeling really weak or vulnerable or like they're not good enough, it turns around in their head, I'm just going to make myself really great. And so it looks a lot like regular narcissism, but when you do, like in our work, we'd call it a clinical interview. When you're talking about where does this come from, it really becomes easy to see the difference in the two, because it's easy to pick up that underlying sense of insecurity and a lack of self-esteem or a lack of self-worth, because that kind of leaks out. So, those people with compensatory narcissism, for instance, they're really sensitive to how other people's how people might react to them. And they're really looking for criticism. And then often they feel shame and humiliated and maybe really anxious around the judgments of others. Well, whereas a typical narcissist or a classic narcissist probably wouldn't care one way or another. And so that's kind of the big difference between the two. Do you have a sense of the person who you're familiar with as a narcissist? Do they fit in one of those categories?
I would say the latter, probably. And it's interesting. And maybe this person couldn't be considered a narcissist, because I wouldn't say this person has an inflated sense of self-esteem. It's more of just a complete disregard for the feelings of others. And maybe that's something entirely, but I mean, either way, or it makes this person extremely difficult to be around. And this person, a lot of it is this person is just convinced that they deserve more than they actually do. This person is incredibly entitled, probably the most entitled person I've ever met in my life. And there's been times where I'm like, how do you think you deserve this? What makes you so confident that you deserve this? Because you haven't done anything to earn it. So maybe that doesn't fit into narcissism, but I mean, I really do think.
No, I think that does.
You think so? Okay. Yeah. But I mean, really, it's just the biggest component is the lack of empathy towards others, or it's all about me.
Has that person ever been in trouble with the law?
Yes.
Yes. And what would you be willing to share? Just in what way? I'm just curious about it, because they might fit what we call that antisocial personality disorder.
I don't think they would fit into the antisocial disorder.
People misunderstand antisocial. Okay. They think they don't like other people. It's not that. It's that they break laws. They don't think laws apply to them.
I see what you're saying.
So a lot of people think, if I'm antisocial, it means I don't want to be around people. It's not that at all.
It means you don't understand social norms, or you don't respect social constructs.
You don't respect the social norms. Like I shouldn't walk into the store and just take what I want, because that's breaking the law, or I shouldn't speed and things like that. Does that kind of fit? Because often they go together. Yeah. Narcissism is often a component of antisocial personality disorder.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah.
So do you want to talk about treatment?
Yeah. Let's talk about treatment.
Or is there more that you want to talk about as far as the actual person, the characteristics?
I think we covered that. I think what I'd maybe like to say is if you're going to marry someone, you need to really know them, because like you said, narcissists, they have this ability to be very charismatic.
Yeah. And so you bring up a really good point about marriage, which I think we talked about last week, possibly.
We've talked about it before.
Right. This idea of really be careful and understand who this person is.
Yes.
I think one of the best ways, this is probably true for all personality disorders, and certainly with narcissism, is to look at what their other relationships are like. So don't just pay attention to what your relationship is like with them.
Right.
But look at their relationship with parents, with siblings, with friends, with with coworkers. Get a sense of who that person is in other contexts. And then I think I've used the term before in these episodes, be aware of red flags. And so if this red flag comes up and you think, wow, that doesn't feel quite right, the way he is with his parents or the way he or she is with his siblings, pay attention to the red flags,
right?
Because it means something. And so that person may be on their very best behavior with you. And I think they really do understand how to behave well, but they can't maintain it.
Right. And that's really good advice, particularly in Utah culture and the church in Utah. I mean, I've said before, marrying a guy I'd known less than a year at the age of 19 was the craziest thing I'd ever done. And going into it, I knew that there could be a possibility that I didn't know what I was getting into, but I had a pretty good, solid foundation in knowing that, okay, there isn't any huge red flags. Knowing the relationship and the respect he had for his mother was very telling for me, particularly given the context of his childhood and the fact that he was completely loved and is devoted to his mother. That was a big green flag, I guess.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree. Absolutely. Yes.
And I think also pay attention to the way they treat, I would say, people who they might consider beneath them
or less fortunate. Often
right.
It's people who might be less. That's a really excellent point, Liz.
Yes.
That is a good thing to pay attention to.
And in a lot of religious cultures, particularly a lot of Christian religions, believe in abstaining from sex before marriage. And this perpetuates to a shorter dating and courtship period. Right. And so it can be really easy for things to just go so fast and you can miss the red flags. So I think it's very helpful for listeners to know the red flags to look for. And so, so pay attention to how they treat people less fortunate than them, or if they ever consider someone to be beneath them, that's a red flag. Or if they treat someone like they're beneath them, and pay attention to the relationship with their relatives. I think that's a really good advice.
Really good advice. I agree.
Yeah. Okay.
So let's talk a little bit about treatment. Now, here's the biggest problem with treatment, which I already mentioned before, is they never think it's their problem.
Yep.
So they're highly unlikely to consider treatment or enter into treatment. And even if you were to say to someone, I think you have like borderline personality disorder, which never goes over well with borderlines. But they just say, well, no, the problem is you. And And, the other thing about narcissists, I can't remember where I heard this, but someone developed a 1-question test to see if you're a narcissist. And the question is, are you a narcissist? And most narcissists will say yes.
Interesting.
And so I think what that means is they kind of like being a narcissist. They like that feeling.
Yeah.
But so if you do find, I think there are some treatments that can be effective. First, there's certainly no medication that we know of that's going to be helpful. So that's not going to be an option. So really what you have is talk therapy. But there's a specific type of talk therapy called DBT, which stands for dialectical behavior therapy.
Okay.
And boy, I think it's been around since the 1970s. So it's been around a long time. And it was eventually where it really got a stronghold is in treating borderlines. And what it does is it helps you. There are certain things that it really focuses on. One is to be able to regulate your emotions. So it's a lot of skill building. How do you regulate your emotions? How do you tolerate distress? How can you be more effective interpersonally? How can you really think about your life in terms of what can you change? Instead of being stuck in, I can't change anything, to what can I change? And then along with that, this seems like contradictory to what I just said, but sometimes we just have to accept, the situations that we're in. I mean, that's true for a lot of us.
Right.
That acceptance.
And it's certainly true for people who are involved with someone who has this personality. You have to accept that they are who they are, and you can't try to change them.
You can't change them, but after we talk about this dialectical behavior therapy, the one thing I know of that works. And so mindfulness, that's the other thing in dialectical behavior therapy, which is just a way to, meditation, things like that, to really become more centered. And so DBT while it had probably its start in treating borderlines, I think it's been found to be effective in really most personality disorders. So if you are with someone, say, who you think might have a personality disorder, I think the treatment to get him into either individually or group, because it's done in both formats, is to try dialectical behavior therapy. And I would guess in any large city, in Salt Lake City, there are many therapists who would practice that. We don't in our group, but there are many, many resources for that. So let's say you're married to a narcissist or someone with a personality disorder. I think really all you have is the ability to set boundaries.
Yes.
That's what they respond to. And, you might have that experience with this person in your life who is a narcissist, is that's all you have. And you hold to your boundaries, and they will push back against the boundaries, but it's what makes life somewhat tolerable with them. Is to set boundaries. And it's the only thing I know of. If you were to read like the classic book on borderline is called Stop Walking on Eggshells. And I'm sure there are many books out there on narcissism. And I would guess that in the end, the takeaway is going to be figure out a way to set boundaries. Well, also acceptance, but figure out a way to set boundaries with these people.
Yeah. Especially if it's not someone that you can just completely cut out of your life.
Well, even that's a boundary.
That's true. Yeah, that's true. It is a boundary. I'd imagine that it's got to be most difficult for a parent to be raising a narcissist, and we all know that kids mentally lack the ability to feel empathy at a certain age. I've often asked myself, I wonder who's more narcissistic today, my 2-year-old, my 4-year-old, or my cat.
But you bring up a really good point. There's a retired professor at the University of Utah. Her name's Lorna Benjamin, and she would have been and probably still is considered really one of, I would go as far as say, the world's experts on personality disorders. And I took a psychopathology class from her many, many years ago. And this is so the first class, she stands up and she says, give me a child and 6 months, and I will give you any personality disorder that you want. So she really believed that it was caused by parenting.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Interesting.
And I think she's probably modified that slightly, but it's a little scary. But what made me think of that is I think one of being a parent, one of our primary tasks is to raise children who are empathetic. And you're absolutely right that kids, I don't know, maybe they would develop empathy on their own. They probably would in some way. Yeah. But I think it's up to us as parents to teach them how to have empathy, how to care for others, how to be aware of what the other person is feeling emotionally. Now, one of the best ways to do that, and I know I've mentioned this before, is John Gottman's parenting program, which he calls either the heart of parenting, or there's another one, emotion coaching.
Okay, yeah.
Is what he calls it as well. And that is a really great way for parents to teach their children empathy, because he believes that the emotional ability of the child is really what determines how far they go in life. And that's up to us as parents. So that was a bit of a diversion, but I think as parents and I think if you have a narcissist, you really ought to look at what you're doing as parenting. Around parenting and focus more on how do you create empathy.
Right. And that was the next thing I was going to lead into is childhood trauma, I would imagine, could play into it, or
not necessarily narcissism.
Okay.
Borderline personality disorder, definitely. Okay. Histrionic personality disorder, definitely. Yeah. And so that is so that's a combination. So you bring up a really good point. The combination, we call it nature and nurture, right? And so the nurturing part is the parenting piece. So how do parents respond to a child who's experienced some sort of trauma?
Right.
That's the nurture piece. And then the nature piece would be, what do we come with? I think we've talked previously about resilience. Some people are resilient, some people aren't. And I don't know, we know a lot about resilience, although I mentioned Sam Goldstein's book about how he thinks we can create resilient children, which would be another good topic sometime. So it's certainly childhood trauma plays into it. I think childhood trauma might play into compensatory narcissism.
Okay. Yeah, I can see that.
Because it's going to negatively affect their self-esteem and their self-concept. And so one of the ways to counter that is to flip it and be compensatory narcissism. So you're right.
And also I think sometimes parents can do all the right things, and sometimes, their child is going to be who they're going to be.
I try and help parents understand that all the time that yes, we can teach them, but in the end, they're an individual.
Yeah. And I think sometimes you can be doing all the right things as a parent, or all the right big things, because no parent is perfect.
No.
But sometimes you can be doing the right things and your child is just, they are who they are.
That's right.
And so I wouldn't want parents to say, wow, I think my child's a narcissist, and oh my goodness, did I do that? Is that my fault? Because I think I would say no, probably.
Well, if your child's a narcissist, then I think you could say, okay, I need to help them with more empathy.
Well, right. And I guess I'm talking more of grown up
children. Oh yeah. Then you can't, you can't,
Yeah.
You're
because,
right. I agree with that.
Yeah. Because there's been times, I have an 8-year-old, and there's been times where I've said, what are you doing here? Like, think about what you did and how this made this other person feel. Because children are inherently inclined to think of themselves, and it's just,
but that's a natural state, and they don't really move out of that. I think they don't move out of that till about 25 is when they start to move out of that, being that egocentric person. So it's a natural stage of development.
Unless they have kids young, because I tell you, I had my first
yeah, that's right.
I had my first kid at age 20, and let me tell you, that cured me of any me. That definitely took that away. So
but I think you will probably acknowledge there are some people who they may have a kid at 20 and they're still me. Yes. And it doesn't work out well.
Yep. So, I know someone like that too.
Yeah. So good for you for not being me.
So takeaway from this week, boundaries. Again, I think if you have someone in your life who is a narcissist, just good boundaries. So next week we are going to get into effective parenting. And
it's kind of an extension of what we were just talking about.
Exactly. Right? Yep. We're going to continue on what we started, effective parenting. Right. So if you have any questions or any parental situations, we would love to hear about them, particularly anything that we remind you of as we're talking about next week. So we're going to delve into some of my parenting foibles that I've run into is how we're going to start. And we're really looking forward to it, and we'd love to hear from our listeners. So thanks everyone for joining us. Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.